We just would like to have a word of prayer and start this session. Shall we pray? Almighty God, we thank you and praise you for this day, for the time that you are giving us. Lord, we look to you for your help and guidance as we have come to the last session of this year's very Reverend V.T. Kurian Memorial Lectures. And we thank you for his life and his ministry and all the contributions that you have given us through him. Lord, we also thank you for this time, especially for Professor Rieger. Help him, oh Lord, to speak to us on this topic. We remember all of us, particularly the KUTS seminary, the principal, and the community members. We commit ourselves into your mighty hand. We also pray for the people who are participating in this webinar. Give us your wisdom, Lord, to understand the situation, to think loud about the future that we all are anxious about. We give you honor and glory. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. I would like to invite Reverend Sandy S. Paul to have the welcome speech.
Thank you, Achan. It's my privilege and honor to offer the words of welcome in this webinar. Principal of the Kerala United Theological Seminary, Professor Dr. David Joy Achan, has been a strong source of inspiration and vision throughout the
There may be some technical difficulties. I'm not able to hear the speaker. I don't know if anybody else is.
Yes, the same thing. Yes, Professor Rieger.
All right.
It is the same thing with everyone, I think so. We will repair it. We will repair it.
Very good. No problem. Well, as the speaker comes back, let me just say a word of thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you. My wife and I spent a few months in India about 2 years ago in the fall of 2018, and I have always been homesick. So it's good to be back in Kerala, even if only virtually. So thank you.
I think now it is also our we are all anxious to know what would be the future days because of COVID-19, and we all are. I myself, I'm really troubled, and I'm thinking about what would be the future of our country, even the global situation, because the situation is very, very bad. It's coming, turning to very, very bad. So let us, hear what does Professor Rieger has to tell us in this context. And this time, I would like to also say, Professor Rieger, we would take certain questions after your presentation. I think we will take up the questions together, and Professor Rieger can respond to those questions together, so that we will have some time more to explain all the questions, I think so. So please, the people who raise questions for clarification, please take it. We'll take it together. Then we will request Professor Rieger to respond to those questions. May I invite Professor Rieger to present his paper, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thanks to everyone and to the principal and to the school for the invitation. I look forward to our time together, and I'm especially interested in the questions that you would be raising, because this is how I learn. And this will be a good opportunity, I think, for an exchange that I have been longing for. I put two links in the chat on the side of your Zoom window. You can see my personal website and also the website of the so-called Wendland Cook program in religion and justice that I'm directing. That Wendland Cook website contains a lot of information. There's a blog series. Some of this actually deals also with COVID-19. We're dealing with issues of economic and ecological justice specifically, but always in a global context and with the conversation with others who are struggling. So feel free to peruse the website. You can also sign up for our newsletter at the bottom. That's another way to stay in contact, and always feel free to also contact me personally. Send an email if you would like. You probably know that I'm a professor of theology at Vanderbilt University, Vanderbilt Divinity School, that's located in Nashville, Tennessee. My background is German. I grew up as a German Methodist, went to seminary there, did my academic work, part in Germany, part in the United States, and have been teaching theology for many years. If you Google my name, you should also find some of my publications. My most recent book might be of interest to you, especially, which is titled Jesus versus Caesar, for people tired of serving the wrong God. And by that, I mean there's problematic Christian assumptions about who God is that Christians have to deal with if we want to serve the true God, who's the God of Jesus Christ. So in this presentation this morning, I will talk about the situation in the United States from my own perspective, which is that of a German-American theologian. I put these thoughts before you, though, not just because I think what's happening in the United States is important, but because I think this is how we can learn together. By me talking about what's happening in my situation, you can compare it to what's happening in your situation, and then we can actually begin a conversation based on that. The solutions that I'm going to propose, I believe, apply therefore not only to the United States or to Europe, but really to many places around the world, because the future, I believe, is shaped in solidarity, maybe the solidarity of what we used to call during the days of the Occupy Wall Street movement, the 99%. There may be a global 99% solidarity emerging, and we'll have to see what that looks like. There is a saying that is attributed to U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, and it goes like this: you can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. It cannot be denied that the majority of Americans at some point or another have been fooled in regard to what really matters. And as many of you may know, today is election day in the United States, and we'll see how that saying applies, if people continue to be fooled or if people are going to wake up. I want to go through 3 examples in my presentation, and you will see that religion is related to each of them. But in the end, I'll make a strong case about religion, and especially, of course, about Christianity, which is the religion that many of us are practicing. My first example simply deals with the nature of inequality, which, as you know, of course, is a global problem, but it's also rampant and rising in the United States, and here it's oftentimes overlooked. My second example is the question about what really matters in people's day-to-day lives. it appears as if many people are failing to realize some of the fundamental questions of life. And here sometimes I believe religion is failing us as well. And my final example will be specifically about religion, which unfortunately is too often assumed to be on the side of the status quo and the powers that be. And therefore it fails to provide what it is supposed to do, namely to guide us into alternative ways of life. As we sort through these three issues, it will become clear how people not only in the United States, but all over the world can stop being fooled and begin to take back power and influence over their lives, their work, and their religion. Meanwhile, much of the world is watching in disbelief about what is happening in the United States under the conditions of COVID-19. Many countries have closed their borders to Americans, and moods have been shifting from widespread irritation about the United States, which was pretty common, to feeling pity for it. COVID-19 is worse here than virtually anywhere else in the world, including India. COVID-19 is worse in the United States than in India, and the numbers continue to rise dramatically. With fall and winter arriving, experts believe that things will get even worse before they get better. Now, for many of us around the globe, our foundations were shaken in the year 2020 by the traumatizing experience of COVID-19, especially because they affected some parts of the population much more than others. In the United States, COVID-19 affected Native Americans, African Americans, and Latin people almost 3 times more than anyone else. And as you have probably heard, these experiences were exacerbated by ongoing deadly displays of police brutality, manifest in the murders of young African American and Latinx persons in the United States. Nevertheless, as you probably also know, in the United States, not everyone has shown concern for the victims. Substantial parts of the population have chosen to ignore both COVID-19 and police brutality against Black and brown people. Following the lead of President Donald Trump and the conventions of white racial supremacy, blind faith in capitalism, and scorn for basic evidence, these people got a short break when the stock market stabilized for a while and conservative America made efforts to regroup. But even though the US stock market recovered after a severe crash in March, and even though there seemed to be some reprieve from the situation, things have gotten worse again. And as you know, COVID-19 in the United States has put millions of people out of their jobs and destroyed many businesses. You may be surprised to learn, though, that hunger is on the rise even in the United States. In the year 2020, 1 in 4 Americans is experiencing what we're calling euphemistically food insecurity. That's a number that's not well known even in the United States. 1 in 4 Americans is actually experiencing hunger and lack of food. Worse yet, if you look at the households with children, it's 1/3 who are food insecure in the United States. 1/3 of all Americans are actually without sufficient food to eat. And this is, of course, one of the wealthiest countries of the world. That gives you an idea about inequality. In addition, the stark realities of racism and inequality, it seems to me, can no longer be ignored in that situation. It is safe to assume that a reckoning awaits on all of these fronts. In this situation, fooling the majority of American people is getting more difficult. And those who are watching from around the world should learn some valuable lessons for their own contexts. As I mentioned a minute ago, today is election day in America. And while it is hard to make predictions, many of us are hopeful that people have been waking up. That is not the case. The reckoning that eventually awaits will be even harsher. At this point, COVID-19 has claimed over 200,000 lives in the United States. And if things get worse, it could be many hundreds of thousands. And unemployment is already reaching groups, not only in the poorest sectors, but also in the middle classes and many other people who are experiencing economic troubles now in their own bodies and oftentimes in the bodies of their own children. So let me turn to the three topics I just mentioned. This was just a basic overview of what we're seeing now. First of all, let me talk about inequality. This is one of the key issues about which many Americans have been fooled. Among the G7 nations, the United States is by far the most unequal, virtually at the level of many developing nations. In the wake of the coronavirus, economic hardships have risen. And let me repeat what I already said a minute ago. 1 in 4 Americans is struggling with hunger. The legacies of racism and sexism are major contributors to this legacy, to be sure, as racial minorities and women are experiencing economic inequality to a greater degree and in greater numbers. But, and this may come as a surprise, anti-Black and anti-brown racism in the United States also hurts many white people themselves. Why is this so? Why would racism hurt even white people? This is so because they mistakenly believe that white supremacy benefits all white people. And therefore, too many white Americans side with white corporate power and with mostly white politics, which rejects universal health care and basic support for working people. In other words, racism in the United States entices white people to support the white elites, not realizing that the racism that supports the white elites may not really benefit the white majority altogether. American billionaires, mostly white, gained $1 trillion United States dollars, US dollars. $1 trillion was gained by mostly white American billionaires during this crisis since March. This is at a time when unemployment rates remain high across the board. In addition, the Trump administration does all it can to continue to undermine the 99% of the population that have to work for a living. There's little help from the major political parties that are blocking each other's efforts. Note that this is not some strange aberration, however. This is how racial capitalism works in the United States, and similar things I know are happening in many other places around the globe. Unfortunately, religion and the churches in the United States are often not helping. They might perhaps protest racism, but they're not really protesting the structures of economic inequality, and certainly not protesting those who are ultimately benefiting from this at the expense of many others. Religion, therefore, is often part of the problem rather than part of the solution because it sanctions inequality and worships a white Christ, a white God, and a white church, all of them elitists. Now, I will get to the alternatives in a minute. This is not my final word about religion, but if you want to find a solution, sometimes you have to address the problems first. So if economic inequality is indeed a key problem in the United States, as I'm arguing, how do we address it? What do we do about it? A new term that has emerged that points in the right direction, I believe, is this notion of essential workers. This term, essential workers, is referring to the kinds of work that is needed to keep people and society alive. This includes people working in agriculture and food production and grocery stores and essential services like hospitals and so on. We have discussed this phenomenon in a blog series sponsored by the Wendland Cook program, and you can look this up if you follow this link that I put in the chat, religionandjustice.org, www.religionandjustice.org. What is most important is that these so-called essential workers are not just victims. They're also the often overlooked agents that might bring about another world. The concerns of race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity all come together in the lives of these essential workers. And there's ample evidence that the roots of these oppressions are effectively addressed when working people organize. Such organizing includes labor unions, but also informal associations of workers that realize that there is power in numbers. And some even are now more and more reclaiming their religious and Christian heritage. This, to me, as a theologian, is especially exciting. Not only the importance of labor, but the importance of labor together with religion, which then helps us to rethink and reclaim our religious legacies as Christians. And to be sure, as people of other faiths as well. Religion in this context can become part of the solution rather than staying part of the problem. I will come back to that in a minute. In 1957, it was Dr. Martin Luther King, who you all know well, who has argued that organized labor has proved to be one of the most powerful forces in removing the blight of segregation and discrimination from our nation. So here, working people organizing has had all kinds of important consequences. If working people fail to organize, on the other hand, there may still be gains in civil rights, as we have seen in the United States in the civil rights movement, but economic inequality will continue to grow and power will become even more concentrated at the top. If you have followed the American Black Lives Matter movement, there is a economic justice platform in Black Lives Matter that basically argues the same thing, that building economic power is not just about money, but it's also about addressing many other inequalities, including racial inequality in our country. Of course, as we're becoming more aware of the potential and the power of essential workers, we might also discuss the kind of work that is not as essential as we once thought. This includes not only people in management, but also people working in churches and the academy, that is us, right? How much of what we do is really essential for the flourishing of humanity and the planet, and in which ways? It would be interesting to have a deeper discussion about that if there is time at the end. How is our own work essential, I think is a crucial question. So my first point about inequality and how religion oftentimes supports the status quo. My second point is this question about what really matters in people's day-to-day lives. While many things matter, of course, in people's lives, here I want to emphasize the importance of work and economics some more. This is a strange conversation in the United States because this is something that is oftentimes not taken seriously. While US people are oftentimes blamed for being too materialistic, they're not fully aware of the importance of work and economics in their lives. Among the growing number of Americans who worry about economic inequality, less than half feel that this is a top priority. Be curious to know what that would be like in India. Add to that the commonplace that Americans, of course, have more things and more color televisions than at any time in history. And the confusion is complete. What is the problem? I would say the problem is that people are being fooled that work and economics are merely about money, and it is suggested that decisions in this realm are best left to the experts. Moreover, part of the problem is that religion often has very little to say about these things, unless you go towards the gospel of prosperity, which has promoted some false solutions, I believe. The truth, however, is that work and economics are not just concerns for experts, but fundamental building blocks of life on the planet Earth. Work and labor are where some of the most formative relationships of life are located. It's, for better or worse, where we spend the bulk of our waking hours. And work and labor are where much of people's energy and creativity are invested. In other words, work, labor, and economic relationships shape the majority of the world's population that have to work for a living, and they shape us to the core. This is why it's important to reclaim these areas of life if you want to reclaim other areas like politics and religion. In other words, we are reclaiming labor here, not just for the sake of labor, but because it may have something to teach us about religion and the other things that we believe also matter in life. Note further, of course, that work is not just important to those who actually have jobs. Work is just as important for those who do not have opportunities to work full-time. That includes the unemployed, people with disabilities, and those who work in the informal economy. Furthermore, work is not just productive work, but also what has sometimes been called reproductive work. And this is the work, as you know, that oftentimes takes the shape of the unpaid work of women and even of nature. But let's not fool ourselves. Without reproductive work, none of us would be here, and without it, no economy could function. Christians should keep in mind that work is also a divine activity, often described in the Bible. I will come back to this in the end, but let me mention here that in the Hebrew Bible, God often performs work, menial labor, and work that is attributed to women, like pottery and sewing. In the stories of creation in the book of Genesis, of course, as you know, God is portrayed as the one who plants a garden and who forms Adam from clay. And what's so fascinating to me about this is that God is not reported to have put to work migrant labor and the planting of a garden, or to have delegated shaping Adam from clay to somebody else who would not mind getting their hands dirty. In other words, God is the migrant worker, and God is the one who gets the divine hands dirty in creation. Now, we could continue this story, but you see where I'm going. For Christians here, what's also important is that we need to reclaim the fact that Jesus was raised as a construction worker in a family of other construction workers. And don't forget, he never turned his back on working people. So maybe this whole question of what matters in life and to reclaim work and labor here is something that would have deep religious and theological insights for all of us. So let me move to my third point, and this is where I spent the bulk of my time in this presentation. My third point is, what does all of this mean for religion? So inequality, COVID-19, racism, the importance of work and labor. What does all of this mean for religion? Ultimately, I'm a theologian and not primarily a social analyst. And so here I want to draw some of the conclusions. Ever since the Roman Emperor Constantine elevated Christianity into the role of the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity has been one of the essential tools of maintaining dominant power. This is something that's well known. I'm not making a unique point here, but I'm simply reminding us that in the history of Christianity, we have become part of these dominant powers early on. And this is something that has shaped Christianity in many ways until the present. In the United States, dominant power is maintained as Christianity has provided various tools for fooling people. This form of Christianity, which differs greatly, by the way, from the religion of Jesus, comes to function as a sort of blind faith that accepts the status quo at face value without probing or questioning. This is my biggest problem with religion these days, this notion that we have to accept things blindly without asking questions and without probing. We see this blind faith, by the way, not only in many churches, and of course churches that in the United States blindly follow leaders like Donald Trump, who refuses to deal with the perils of the pandemic, who refuses to deal with racism, and who does not even embody the most basic religious values like compassion, decency, or morality. An odd sort of blindness, I submit to you, especially if you're looking at the United States from the outside. But we wonder about this from the inside all the time as well. Moreover, we see this blind faith not only in religion per se, but we also see it in the world of finance. So it's spreading. It's not just about religion. It's really about life. And in the world of finance, we've seen this blind faith in the midst of COVID-19, where performance indicators hardly seem to matter anymore in the valuation of the stock market. In other words, unemployment is rising, businesses are failing, yet the stock market is also rising. There is something like blind faith going on here, because this is what ultimately drives people assuming that something like a rising tide will lift all boats, which of course is blind faith because it cannot be perpetuated indefinitely. One more example here about blind faith. We see it also in a culture that fails to deal with its racism. And this blind faith, again, is problematic because it's covering up what's really happening, what is really happening in the United States with police brutality and many other forms that racism is taking here. In my own work, if you follow my publications, this has been one of my major concerns. Certainly in my work on religion and economics, there's a 2009 book titled No Rising Tide, and the subtitle is Economics. Sorry, I can't even remember my subtitle now. Here's the book, No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics, and the Future, where my basic argument was in the Great Recession of 2007, 8, and 9, that we're ultimately closing our eyes to the most important realities, and therefore we're not able to resolve our problems. By the way, I'm not the only one arguing this. There's even economists that have argued that economics, the discipline of economics, now also functions by a blind faith that simply refuses to acknowledge reality and thereby eventually fools itself and creates the problems that we're now seeing. Let me come back to religion here, though, because I believe that this is one of the major forms in which Christianity has become problematic, proclaiming a blind faith that does not allow us to think about reality, and certainly does not really allow us to think about God at work in the midst of this reality. So blind faith that accepts things at face values without the ability to ask questions is at the core of the problem of religion today. Unfortunately, this is the kind of religion that many people think about when they use the term religion. And of course, it's not just limited to Christianity, but I'm a Christian theologian, so I have to address what's happening in my own backyard. If you look more broadly to the discipline of religious studies, you could see that this is now a definition of religion that has become more broadly accepted. Because too oftentimes, even scholars of religion seem to think that faith that refuses to see is all there is to religion. And some even assuming that's a good thing. Big ideas, traditions, the past. This is what religion is, rather than engagement with the present. The good news that I want to bring to you today is that religion does not have to be defined in this way. Religion does not have to be seen as big ideas or blind faith or something that cannot be questioned. One other model for thinking about religion is this notion that you find in the book of Acts in the New Testament, where Christians are called the people of the way. Christians are the people of the way rather than the people of the idea. I think this is crucial, and we might talk about this in our discussion afterwards. You see this also in other passages, certainly in the Gospels. For instance, where John the Baptist from prison sends his disciples to Jesus, wondering if he's the one who is to come or if they should wait for somebody else. You'll find these passages in Matthew 11, verses 5 and 6. the response that Jesus gives in Matthew to John the Baptist is not just believe. It's not, here's the great idea. It's not, there's joy in heaven. But Jesus actually tells John's disciples to go and tell John what you hear and see. Go and tell John what you hear and see. And then the list includes healing the sick, the raising of the dead, and the bringing of good news to the poor. And that may well be the biggest miracle of all, the bringing of good news to the poor, because a lot of people, even if they believe that Jesus can heal sick people, even if they believe that Jesus can heal and even raise people from the dead, they don't believe really that Jesus can bring Christianity and religion can bring good news to the poor. And let me remind you, what is good news to the poor, right? Good news to the poor is not that the poor will have a hot soup tonight or some meal that you serve them. Good news to the poor ultimately is you will no longer be poor. Now that's a miracle, but this is what we hear Jesus talking about in the Gospels. And this is what ultimately religion seeks to accomplish. It's not just about great ideas or blind faith or false hope. It is about seeing real change around us. So the good news here is that Christianity and religion in general, perhaps, does not need to be grounded in blind faith, but can be rooted in informed ways of life. And therefore, it should come as no surprise that different forms of religion are emerging and reasserting themselves in the midst of COVID-19. Religion actually continues to make a difference in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of growing inequalities, in the midst of overt and covert racism and sexism. Among those efforts, and let me just mention a few examples here, are again these efforts to reclaim relations of faith and labor that once upon a time, about 100 years ago, in America, won working people the 8-hour workday, weekends off work, protections for women at work, and the end of child labor. So there has been tremendous progress accomplished when labor and religion have worked together. They haven't done so in a long time in the United States, but they're doing so again. And I know you have some of this in India and in many other places around the world. So here you see not only the beginning of new social movements, but you also see the revitalization of religion in a way that's actually quite surprising. Something that people may not have expected, but once you look for it, you have to see it. Of course, such issues include not only the labor movement and other worker-based movements. Here in Nashville, they also include the incubation of worker-owned cooperative businesses, for instance. There is now the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development here in Nashville that not only brings workers together to control their own work and their own lives more specifically, but it also works together with churches and religious communities who are realizing that if you're developing economic democracy, you might also be able to strengthen your political democracy, and who knows, maybe religious democracy will follow. So imagine religion here not only contributing to social change, but itself benefiting from it, because it brings us back to our roots in a way that we have not seen in a long time. Religion here is reminded that our own roots lie with God doing work and with Jesus being part of the working world as well. Now, imagine if religion, therefore, had more than just a couple of big ideas, and if religion then was part of people's movements that found their own voice, not only in religion, but also in politics and perhaps even in economics. In other words, if religion is understood not as blind faith, but as informed ways of life, then we can move forward. And here I would argue we could even now think again about new interreligious engagements. So this is not just about Christianity or Judaism. We now engage with our Muslim brothers and sisters, with engaged Buddhists, and many others in our own context. Because the basis here is no longer that we all have to be the same, but that we all care about life and the development of life. And the question for religion is, what difference does it make? How are we contributing? How is our God shaping up? How are our images of God shaping up in this? And this is one of the basic research concerns that we're pursuing in this program that I'm directing, this Wendell Cook program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt University. I want to conclude with a couple of specific comments about God, because ultimately theology, the work that I'm doing, that many of you are doing, is not just talking about God, but not just talking about the church and the world. It's also talking about God. And what is perhaps most exciting to me as a theologian is that here God talk is reoriented from pie in the sky talk, which is often fooling people, to talk about what is actually happening in the lives of people, beginning with those places where the pressure is greatest. Images of God now have to be double-checked in comparison to images of what we now call essential workers. What if we envision God as essential worker rather than as the CEO or the manager? Now, let me remind you that this is not a crazy idea of a German-American theologian. This is actually the way the Bible oftentimes talks about God, namely as an essential worker rather than as a top-down manager. What if the difference that God is making comes from a different direction than we oftentimes expect? Too often when we talk about God, we look up in the sky and assume that help will come from the top down. What if God, as God has done in our own traditions, is actually walking among us in such a way as to make a difference, as to join working people in planting gardens and fields, in weaving, in baking, in cooking, in sewing, and even cleaning. And all of these are examples you have in the Bible. I'm not making this up. Just go back and read not only the Hebrew Bibles, but also the New Testament. And as I said before, this God does not shy away from the kind of labor that in patriarchal society is oftentimes put off on women. So what if these are not merely sentimental ways of talking about God, but challenges to images of God as emperor or God as a tyrant? What if God's work resembled more the work of migrant workers whose labor is essential and perhaps more essential than whatever Donald Trump is doing at the moment? These are deep theological questions that cannot be resolved in just one presentation. But I believe that these questions need to guide us into a new way of dealing with religion, reclaiming our legacies, reclaiming the Bible, reclaiming our denominational theological traditions, which ultimately are not just struggles of ideas, but struggles about ways of life. And I believe that this is the place where new ways of life are already emerging. And as theologians, we have to follow what's going on. So in conclusion here, if religion is seen in solidarity with those who have become known as essential workers during COVID-19, we may have a change of participating in what is essential in surprising ways. Of course, we know that these workers are a diverse group. They're made up of all races, genders, nationalities, and even of different religions. What is amazing to me, though, is that there is a sense that these workers are walking on the way that ultimately leads to life, whereas others are walking on ways that lead to damnation. So in sum, to practice religion, therefore, I would say, means to participate in essential things, in essential ways, not affirming dominant reality, not ignoring dominant reality, but eventually transforming it. I could go on in this lecture, but I think I have said a lot of things now, and maybe some things that make you curious and want to ask questions, and maybe also raise some challenges. So let me conclude my lecture here, thanking you again for the invitation and looking forward to the discussion and to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rieger, for your presentation, and we have taken many of the challenges that you have put forth before us, the people here from India and from America and from Germany, and it's also that you have tried to come out with theologies, not professing something, but it is also practicing. And thank you for that statement. And also that you have clearly made a statement that accepting things without probing is not very good, right? So we would also like to ask you some questions and for more clarification, so that you may be able to give us more clarification on your theme. That everyone is, as I said before, everyone is anxious. What would be the future? And we come back to the Bible and find what our Lord has done, even in the crisis which he had faced during his lifetime on this earth. I think now the floor is open to raise questions, and I would like you to ask questions together, so that Professor Rieger would be able to give you a response together, so that we will be able to get more time. That maybe egalitarian concept here again. Each question will get some time, and Professor would be able to give us their response. Now the floor is open. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your valuable talk. See, I have got two questions. And my first question will be, is religion actually in solidarity with the poor? And then one more question I need to ask. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic, it has actually brought many pre-existing inequalities into a sharp focus. And we know that we are facing many inequalities in terms of healthcare, technology, education, even ethnicity. We are facing inequalities. So we have in these days many cutting edge technologies, and we are actually using it. And we have a recent prediction from the World Economic Forum that in the coming years, that is within the 5 years, for the next 5 years, we are going to face a reduction in the number of jobs. I mean, millions of people are going to lose their jobs, and at the same time, those jobs will be replaced by the machines, or the automated machinery will be accessing those jobs because of the social distancing measures and other many restrictions which we are actually facing now. So the living standards have actually what means living standards are actually changed, and it is going to change much faster than we have actually expecting. So how can you evaluate the future of our living standards? How can you evaluate this type of inequality in our present context? So my first question is religion actually in solidarity with the poor? And the second one will be the future of our living standards. How can you evaluate it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very helpful question.
Professor, we'll take some more questions. Yes, Saju Mary Abraham, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your enlightening talk on how religion is so much intricately connected with the layers of inequality we see all around. How religion is so much related to the day-to-day questions of people, and we need to wrestle with such questions. And so you have brought out one factor as essential worker. Now, when from my context, from India, in the context of COVID, we see so much of the essential workers being deprived, essential workers being discriminated, and they are ignored. We see them all around, but the many these people are the people who lay foundations for our very society, but they are being ignored. So COVID-19 in a way has exposed these realities. Now with your keyword of essential worker, now how can we do more of God talk in terms of this essential worker, and analyze our own work in terms of building the essential lives of essential workers? Especially this is especially when predictions have been done that more and more casualties of human lives are going to be affected. So this essential worker is very much needed. And how do we do more of the God talk in terms of these precious lives? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, Prasadachan, please.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Professor, for the inspiring talk. Here, in case of religion and politics in India, on the basis of religion, a new form of nationalism is emerging, and the ruling elites or ruling fundamentalists are no longer inclusive in their nature. In such a context, is it possible to develop a political and religious praxis of resistance in the neo-colonial conditions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Achan. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, please. Please raise your question.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rieger, for your inspiring presentation. This is the second time I am attending your presentation. The first time I had a chance to hear from you during the sessions which held at Philippines, March 2019. So my question is related to your statement. One of your statement from the book Jesus versus Caesar, your latest publication. In the 4th chapter, you had stated that both in the days of Caesar and today, wealth is ultimately a matter of maintaining a close relationship with the power that be and the trust that this relation will last. So this was a statement from the chapter 4, the God versus Mammon, and you already mentioned about the power of wealth in religious matter. So on the basis of this pandemic situation, how do you see this statement in this context, especially the pandemic situation, the religion, and even the world economy is in a crisis to maintain their economic stability, and religion also affected that economy. So how do you see this stability? And can you relate this statement with the first century economic practices, the economic practices of the church in the first century? Thank you.
Thank you.
Achan.
Thanks.
Any more questions? I think we have already 4 questions, and we will take one more question. Then Professor Rieger can. Yeah, Devasachan, please. Reverend Devasya, please. Yes, Reverend Devasya, please. Yes.
Hear me?
Yeah, please. You can raise your question. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rieger, for your talk. I have just one comment and one question to you. The topic which we have given is rethinking religion in the context of COVID-19 and the wealth issues or the economic issues that we have been facing today. So thank you for bringing us the latest information about U.S. and what's going on there. We are having no presidential election and all. So it's going to be tough. At the same time, it's going to affect the whole community at large. One of the observations I'd like to make with regard to presentation is that we are trying to get a solution to the problem we face today in the midst of COVID-19. We are rethinking we are looking for an alternative. I have little issues with what you have said about the faith and the way. If you study each religion has been formed on the basis of their own faith and foundations and fundamental truths of each religion. And in your last part of your presentation, you say that not simply the people of the faith, but people of the way. So I think both things should go together, both faith and the way together. And I would like to have some clarification from you with regard to what kind of alternative that we can make in this particular context.
Thank you, Reverend Devasya, for your question. I think we have, Professor, we have 5 questions now. I think we will take up the questions, and may I request Professor Rieger to give his response to the questions, please.
Thank you so much. Those are all very good questions, and I have taken notes, so I have the questions written down. I will not forget any of them, because there's a lot of important questions here, and you know, it's a special joy for me to be giving this lecture in Kerala, because I think you have some of these solutions in your own state here, and I will talk about that in a minute. The first question about is religion in solidarity with the poor? If that's a question, a lot of it is not in solidarity with the poor. And I think even religion that tries to help the poor sort of from the outside is oftentimes problematic, because then help becomes patronizing, top down, you know, not really involved. But let's look at it from the other side. You know, oftentimes the poor are already in religion, right? I mean, of course, I know in India you have a strong Dalit Christianity, but even people who are not Dalits, you know, not all of us are necessarily members of the elite classes, right? And so if you think about religion in solidarity, you have to start looking at where is it already practiced, how is it being practiced, what can we learn from these practices? And this is, you know, to link that to the final question, this is the alternative that I'm seeing. It's not a great idea that I'm proclaiming from America, but it is saying, let's look at where Christianity is being practiced in the trenches, as it were. How is it that alternatives might already be emerging? And this is where each of us will have to evaluate what it looks in our own contexts. I talked about the religion and labor movement that I see as emerging in the United States. This is not something that you will find in the newspapers yet, but you will find it if you go to the Wendland Cook website. We have some faith and labor webinars. We have some discussions. We work closely together in a way that hasn't happened in many years. And this is not just because we're doing it. I think when we ask about alternatives and when we ask about solidarity, we really have to ask the question of agency. That is to say, who is actually at work here? And of course, as people of faith, we believe that God is at work, but I'm saying that God is at work in unexpected places, in unexpected people that we're oftentimes not paying enough attention to. This is not a romanticizing idea of others, but it's really saying there are things happening that we have to take more seriously. I'll put in the chat a book that my wife and I co-authored a few years ago. She's a community and labor organizer now working with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. the title of which is Unified We're a Force, How Faith and Labor Can Overcome America's Inequalities. That gives you a few ideas of how we are thinking this agency is actually shaping up. And if you don't have the book in your library, I'd be happy to make sure that you get a copy. Let me know if you need it. So back to Kerala here. When we were, Rosemary and I were there in 2018, we took one side trip up to Munnar, where we had the opportunity to speak with some tea picker women. And some of you, of course, know exactly who I'm talking about, and how they were actually talking about how they're organizing solidarity, even sometimes over against a union that is not responsive enough to the demands of working people. So here you get the grassroots activity, you get the notion that women are taking, part in the struggle, and sometimes they're leading the struggle, right? And here, I think, as we're asking for alternatives, these are some real alternatives that have to be taken into account. And I believe that this is the role of churches and of theologians to pay more attention to there, not to naively accept things at face value again, but to ask these questions. So this is the second question about the essential workers. I believe there's a lot happening. And I know also my good friend George Zechariah has oftentimes talked to me about the unions and cooperatives of fishermen, also in Kerala. He has written about this. This is something that all I'm saying is, what if we develop that some more? By the way, I'd love to come back and talk more to those groups, what they're doing in Kerala, because I believe this is important. And I believe that religion is too oftentimes missing that, especially if we think about that simply as social activism. One more comment about the final question. Is it faith or is it the way? My point was it's really both. It's the way reshaping faith, and it's faith shaping the way, which is, of course, the beauty of it. Unfortunately, we're oftentimes missing it. Those of us who are theologians, we think faith is something that we can get from all the books around us, instead of looking for it in the embodiment of the people. So how is this reshaping God talk was part of the second question. That's part of what we're talking about in this book that I put in the chat, Unified We're a Force. I think it completely and fundamentally re-envisions how we talk about God. Liberal Christians are oftentimes pluralistic. You see this, in Europe and the U.S. especially. They say, well, God could be a worker, and God can be a manager, and God can be white, and God can be black, and all of that. That's not the way the Gospels talk about God. They talk about God in Jesus as somebody who has a very specific solidarity, who has a very specific commitment. And those who are not part of this commitment, they're invited to become part of it. But it's not a one-size-fits-all deal. Mary, Jesus's mother, says it very clearly. God lifting up the lowly. This is in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke in the Magnificat. God lifting up the lowly while pushing the powerful from their thrones. That's tough to preach, but at the same time, I believe that this is the way that eventually the powerful will also be saved. And maybe even the powerful can then enter into this solidarity that the first question asked about. The third question was about nationalism in India. Of course, I know. I have studied what is going on there with Hindutva and so on. But of course, we have nationalism in the United States now in a way. Too, and my own German legacy, nationalism was always a pernicious thing that created more problems than it solved. However, I think we will not resolve nationalism simply on a political level, because nationalism is a political tool. It's also a political trick that is based on bringing people together in terms of, a certain nation without realizing that they don't have that much in common. In India, this, right? India is a very diverse country. You have inequality, and Indian nationalism is not serving all Indian people. It's serving some elites. The same for American nationalism or German nationalism. It never served all of the people. It only served the elites by fooling the people to think that they have something in common with it. The way to solve it, I would argue, is actually to start looking at what's happening at the grassroots. Who's really benefiting from this? To build not just political power, but some economic power that then helps back up some of the political power. And that then also feeds back into religious power. Keep in mind, too, this is now talking about non-Christian religions. I mean, they're not monolithic either. So if Hindutva in a dominant Hinduism is maybe part of the problem, there's other Hinduisms, knowing some, maybe not many, but some feminist Hindus in India that I find very hopeful. There are some things, may not be big, but it exists. The same is true for Christianity. In the US, Christianity is part of the problem of American nationalism. And me as a Christian, that does not lead me to divest from Christianity or to drop Christianity, but to reclaim it in a way that is more hopeful and life-giving. This question about my book, where I talk about, was the fourth question about the relation to the powers that be. I think this is how a lot of people try to solve our problems. They think we can only solve our problems by relating to some benevolent powers that be. Oftentimes this means, relating to Europe, which may be more benevolent than the United States, but, also relating to the United States. Then it means talking about development, assuming that, by complying with the dominant forces, we can basically lift everybody out of their misery. It does not always work like that. This is what Latin American liberation theology 40, 50 years ago discovered. There's a problem with development that does not name the powers that be, or the powers that be ultimately disappear behind a veil of benevolence and the pretense of saving people. So what I'm suggesting instead then is precisely to build these things. This is the question of alternatives, to build these things from the bottom up. If the first questioner was right, and I believe he was right, saying that there is going to be this growing inequality that's going to get much worse, how will we solve that? We will not solve it by appealing to the benevolence of those who are benefiting from this inequality, who will then maybe give some benevolent contributions and philanthropy. We can only solve it, I believe, by looking at where change is happening, by tying into these grassroots dynamics. And that's not primarily for political reasons. I think that's my conclusion now, this is for deeply theological reasons, because in our traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and I think the other Abrahamic one here also, Islam, there's a clear commitment to justice. God self is committed to justice. And in Christianity specifically, God is embodied in these struggles, where we can think about Jesus not just as a great preacher, but as somebody who walks the talk and as somebody who ends up organizing for a better world. I'll end here. There are many more thoughts, but thank you for these great questions. I'd love to continue that at some point, and maybe we'll see each other in person once COVID is over.
Thank you, Professor Rieger, for your response. And I think we are at the time, and we need to wind up the webinar. Thank you so much for your sharing, Professor Rieger. And I hope our people, the people who have participated in this webinar, have really come up with certain questions and confirming what was Professor Rieger was sharing with us. And with that, I think we will close this session. Before that, I will request our principal to make his final words before we closing. Now I request Mr. Shibu Devadas to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening to our respected principal, invited chief guest, all the teaching faculty, and all my dear friends. I consider this as my great privilege to say the word of thanks to all those who partake and participate in this webinar. First of all, I thank God who enabled us to join together under this topic as a webinar. At first, I would like to say word of thanks to our respected principal, for he has arranged this webinar for us. Indeed, he is a well-known theologian, good speaker, and a man of God. On behalf of our seminary community, I express our sincere thanks to our principal. Secondly, I like to say thanks to our Professor Reverend Vinod Allen for moderating this webinar in a good manner. At present, he is our seminary registrar. On behalf of our seminary, all faculty, I extend my heart full of thanks to our registrar, Reverend Vinod Allen. And now I would like to say word of thanks to our guest speaker, Professor Jeorg Rieger. Sir, indeed, your words have inspired all of us. You have given a good insight about this topic, rethinking religion under the condition of COVID-19 and economic calamity. On behalf of all the faculty and students, I express very heartfelt thanks and gratitude. Fourthly, my word of thanks goes to respected Professor Reverend Sandy S. Paul, who has coordinated this webinar nicely. On behalf of all the faculties and our seminary community, I extend sincere thanks to Reverend Sandy S. Paul. Finally, I say thanks to all our friends who are participating in this webinar through Zoom and YouTube. Once again, I thank you all for your nice participation. Thank you all. Thank you.
Now, may I request our beloved principal, Reverend Dr. C.A. David Jeorg, to speak to us. Achan.
Thank you. Good evening, friends. I would like to recognize the presence of Professor A.B. Joseph and Reverend Dr. Eli Sahanam and many other very distinguished friends and relatives of Kerala United Theological Seminary. This is like a dream is fulfilled. Dr. Jeorg Rieger was supposed to come physically to India this year, and we were eagerly planning for a public lecture as well as a series of seminars. But the plans have changed because of COVID-19, and I am indeed grateful and delighted to see you virtually and accept the offer in terms of giving a book. We do not have that copy of the book. So we would happily take the book, and I'm sure your presence, your conversations, and your response have enriched all of us and challenged all of us to move forward in terms of solidarity with the ignored people, neglected people, and marginalized people. Friends, you will agree with me that we have had a very brainstorming sessions for the past 2 days. We have inter-semester seminar and V.T. Kurian memorial lecture. Under the category of inter-semester seminar, we have had Dr. Jancy James, former Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University, presenting a paper on new education policies, and Dr. M.G. Radhakrishnan, Chief Editor of Asianet television channel, presenting about new humanity. And now we have Dr. Jeorg Rieger talking to us about the economic calamity. We also had V.T. Kurian Memorial, Very Reverend V.T. Kurian Memorial Lecture yesterday by Dr. John T. Matthew. I thank all of them sincerely on behalf of the seminary community. Three people have worked very hard. They have labored day and night to make this possible. Reverend John Davidson Johnson, Reverend Sandy S. Paul, and Reverend Jacob Devasia, who have coordinated this without any mistake, consulting everyone in the community for assistance. And on behalf of the community, I thank three coordinators very sincerely. And there are a number of people, student friends who are in the campus, helped us physically, particularly Rieger Matthew, who have handled, and a couple of other students who have handled technical aspects. And our chaplain, Reverend Jeorg, Jeorg, who offered all assistance in terms of online and virtual meetings. I also thank Reverend Vinodalan and all others who have moderated this session. Friends, this is the holiday is over, inter-semester break is over, and tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we will have the reopening worship. And I expect all of you to attend without fail, and we will have classes as per the schedule. Have a wonderful evening. Once again, George, thank you very much for your presence and conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And
thank you.
Thank you for having me.